Hello! Today's video is a continuation of the topic discussed in my weekly Substack newsletter, to which I invite you to subscribe using the link in the description to this video, and it considers about precision. In this game that we are going to illustrate today, we will take a look at two types of precision. Precision, where we have calculational play, where we are very limited in the number of moves that are precise and good, and precision in the conversion phase, where we have a wider choice, and precision basically means avoiding the opponent's counterplay. So today's game is actually taken from the Montreal tournament in 1979, which is also discussed in the newsletter, and it features one of Mikhail Tal's victories in that tournament. As a reminder, that tournament was won by Mikhail Tal and Anatoly Karpov jointly with an exceptional score of 12 points out of 18 games. Take a look at the newsletter, read the newsletter for the more detailed description and explanation of precision and the difference in the precision between Mikhail Tal and Anatoly Karpov in this tournament. I think you will be surprised, as I was, when I discovered who was actually the more precise player in Montreal. Now on to the game. e4, c6. Tal's opponent, Robert Hübner, was an elite player already from the beginning of the 70s and well into the 80s. Since this was played in 1979, we actually have a game between two of the best players in the world at that time. So Hübner chooses the Caro-Kann, and historically speaking, Tal probably did not have too many good memories of facing the Caro-Kann, because that was the opening that Mikhail Botvinnik chose in their revenge match in 1961, and Tal had really problems against this opening. Part of it was Tal's ill health, and also I think the wrong choice of the advanced variation, which did not suit his style. In this game, he went actually for the main line after d4, d5 and knight d2. Nowadays, the advanced variation with d5 is again all the rage. Some of Tal's ideas have survived until today, but mostly white players treat this variation in a different way today. Knight d2 is still played, but after d takes e4, knight takes e4. Traditionally, the main moves have been Capablanca's variation bishop f5, as chosen by Hübner in this game, and Smyslov and Karpov's preference with knight d7, intending knight f6. However, nowadays, all the rage is the move knight f6, which for many years was considered inferior. However, modern engines and practice have shown that after knight takes f6, e takes f6, black obtains relatively good piece play in exchange for these doubled pawns on the f file. So this is how the Caro-Kann players treat the main line with knight d2 nowadays. But in 1979, bishop f5 was a move that was commonly played. Knight g3, bishop g6, h4, h6, knight f3, threatening knight e5, knight d7. Modern theory has discovered that actually it is also possible to allow knight e5, but back then this was considered not possible. So h5. Again, modern theory always has developments, and for many years Tal's move h5 was considered a precise move because white gains a tempo and fixes black's kingside structure with h5. But today, in fact, the immediate bishop d3 is often preferred, leaving the h5 square available for a knight, for example. But okay, let's go back to the game. h5, bishop h7, now bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and now again a modern twitch. Black should develop, and developing moves are knight gf6 and e6. Hübner played knight gf6, but modern theory again considers e6 as the more precise move. And the reason for this is that after bishop f4, like Tal played in the game, preventing queen c7, controlling the c7 square, black has the following maneuver: queen a5 check, as Hübner played in the game, bishop d2, and now we see the difference between a6 and knight f6. With e6 already played, black has the option of bishop b4, and this is not available with knight gf6 as Hübner played in the game, because the pawn is still on e7 in that position. After bishop b4, c3, bishop e7, c4, attacking the queen and queen c7. Modern theory and practice show that this expansion, in fact, of c4, d4 gives black more chances for counterplay. A lot of theory involved, obviously, but this is the conclusion nowadays, that black is actually doing fine, having provoked white to play c4. So that's the current state. Hübner played knight gf6, and now this is not possible. And now after bishop f4, queen a5, bishop d2, there is no bishop b4, so queen c7 is forced. Long castle e6, and now after white has a choice: king b1, queen e2, knight e4, and this position is considered favorable for white today. Knight e4 played by white. So since this is favorable for white, that's why black players actually play e6 instead of knight f6, in order to have this bishop b4 idea at their disposal. So knight e4, long castle, and g3. This is an important move for white. The idea is to allow for the move bishop f4 to harass that queen on c7. Knight e4. Black has different moves at his disposal. c5 is one, knight c5 is another, but everywhere white maintains the initiative. So knight takes e4, queen takes e4, knight f6. There is also bishop d6, there is bishop e7, but as I said, white is better everywhere to a smaller or bigger extent. Knight f6 attacks the queen with tempo, queen e2, and now c5. This is probably the starting point of black's problems. There is bishop d6 move, there is also rook d5, but these were probably the better options. But again, the opening theory is not what we are looking at, not of our concern actually when analyzing this game. So c5 played by Hübner, d takes e5, bishop c5. It appears that black managed to finish development and get rid of this pawn on d4, which was giving white a space advantage. But thanks to this h5 move, white has the very strong move rook h4. And it turns out that the initiative is quite strong. The rook on the 4th rank introduces ideas like rook c4, for example, and the initiative is quite unpleasant here. Now the only move for more or less for black was the move queen e7, trying to evacuate at least one piece from the c file. But after Hübner's king b8, which evacuates another piece from the c file, the problem with the move is that evacuating the king from the c file piles up the king and the queen on the h2 b8 diagonal, and Tal now starts to play in a very precise way, obtaining a winning advantage thanks to a very nice combination. So he starts with bishop f4 with a deadly pin. So the only move is bishop d6, and now precision is required. Rook takes d6. So in the combinational phase, Tal is very precise. So rook takes d6, and now the idea is knight e5. So it turns out that white voluntarily blocks the h2 b8 diagonal, but with knight e5 introduces two strong threats, knight c4 and knight f7, both attacking the rook on d6. And in spite of having a move, black cannot evacuate both the king and the queen in time. Hübner played king a8, evacuating the king, and now Tal again is precise in obtaining the winning advantage, but at the same time not allowing too much counterplay. For example, he could have gone for knight f7, winning a pawn and attacking that rook on d6, but after e5, queen takes e5, queen takes f7, queen d6, queen a2, looks a bit unpleasant and unnecessary to the human eye. White is a pawn up, but his king is not entirely safe. And once the engine just says that white is winning, but when you calculate this type of lines during a game, you instinctively don't want to go here, and you just want to avoid it if possible. And in fact, it was possible, and Tal avoided it. He played knight c4, and now there are no ideas like this, because the a2 g8 diagonal remains closed. So the rook is attacked, knight e8, yeah, and now rook g4. Again, precise. For the time being, white maintains the pin and attacks the pawn on g7, which cannot be defended. To illustrate this, after rook g8, for example, defending the pawn, white goes knight takes d6, knight takes d6, and now queen d3 is a very important move, attacking the pinned knight on d6 and also introducing queen h7 ideas. Now the only way to save the knight is rook d8, and now simply rook g7 wins the pawn with a similarly winning position as in the game. So rook g4, queen e7, getting away from the pin, but now simply knight takes d6, knight takes d6, rook g7, and white won a pawn. So we saw that in the combinational phase, starting from rook h4 and then rook d6, Tal was very exact, knight c4 being also a move that prevented counterplay, and now he has obtained a winning position simply because he's a pawn up. So 3 against 2 on the queen side and 3 against 3 on the other side of the board, and he has a technically winning position. But the key factor in this position is not so much that these 3 against 2 on the queen side are decisive. In fact, they are not, because white cannot freely advance with them because that would weaken his king. In fact, the decisive factor in this position are the weaknesses that black has on the king side, especially the pawn on h6 and this one on f7, and the dominating bishop against the black knight. Also, white also has an active rook that he will use to attack these weaknesses. So these are the factors that give white a decisive advantage. And from this point onwards, Tal makes sure that his precision is not necessarily the engine's, let's say, most forcing or the best choice, but he chooses moves that try to contain or completely prevent his opponent's counterplay. So it's a different type of precision. It's a choice of several moves, and he would choose the one that prevents counterplay. Now knight f5, attacking the rook, rook g4, rook d8, and now bishop e5. This opens the fourth rank for the rook and also activates the bishop on the long diagonal. f6, attacking the bishop, bishop c3 and e5. So what black tries to do is, by positioning the pawns on the dark squares, to limit the mobility of the bishop. But by playing f6, he weakens the g6 square, which the rook will use to attack both the pawns on h6 and f6. And a second point of this advance is that there is no longer a pawn on e6 to defend the knight on f5, which makes the knight on f5 not very stable. The first thing that Tal does now in the conversion phase is to improve the position of his king. So he goes b3. The idea is to get the king to b2, where he simply avoids any checks along the first rank. a6, black does the same, opens a luft for his king, king b2, improving the position of the king, queen e6, and now queen c4. So Tal plays in a way typically when you have the advantage, by playing moves that seek exchanges. So by exchanging queens, that he would have an easier task because black wouldn't have any counterplay. With the queens on board, black could still perhaps hope to create some counterplay, and we will see some lines where this counterplay is possible. So to illustrate, after queen c4, rook c4, white is just easily winning. Some ideas like rook c7, rook f7, going after the pawn on f6, or to h7, going after that pawn on h6, especially after g4, getting rid of that knight on f5 is a relatively elementary win. So black's only chance is to keep the queens on board. So queen e8 attacks the pawn on h5, rook g6. White uses the strong g6 square for the rook, from where it attacks the pawns on f6 and h6. Rook c8 attacks the queen, and now Tal again, understanding that the exchange of queens is in his favor, goes queen a4. In fact, it was possible to play immediately queen e4, and in case of knight d6, queen d5. Yeah? But Tal goes queen a4 first. And again, the idea is that after queen a4, ba4, this perhaps is a difficult move for a weaker player to play queen a4, because the superficial and initial impression would be, but I have just completely spoiled my queenside majority. Yeah, now it's completely useless. I doubled my pawns on the a file. I cannot create a passed pawn. But the deciding factor, as I said, are the weaknesses that black has on the king side, and here white wins a pawn by force, because he cannot defend both h6 and f6, especially as the g4 is a threat attacking the knight. For example, rook c6 defending the pawn on f6, but now g4 attacks the knight, and if the knight moves the pawn on h6 will be lost when the passed h-pawn will decide the game. For example, rook b6 check, king c1, rook c6, trying to harass the bishop, but now the simple and elegant tactic, bishop takes e5, winning a second pawn, and the third is on the way, and the fourth is likely on the way, and the justification is that the bishop cannot be taken after ef takes e5, because rook takes e6, bc6, gf5 is a winning pawn endgame for white, because the pawn promotes and black cannot stop it. So queen a4 therefore is another move that seeks the exchange of queens. Black understandably avoids it, queen d8, and now queen e4. So now the knight is attacked, knight d6, and now another precise move by Tal. He goes queen d3. With a queen on d8, black has the option to double on the c file with queen c7, attacking the bishop and perhaps the pawn on c2, and this is visible in case of queen d5, which would be a mistake, because after queen c7 the bishop is attacked, yeah, and defending it with queen d3 allows e4, and all of a sudden black creates counterplay. So these are the type of lines that the player must try to avoid when converting an advantage. So Tal is precise. He goes queen d3, understanding the danger on the c file, and defends both the bishop and the pawn on c2. Now in case of e4, simply queen e3, and the bishop remains defended, whereas both these pawns on h6 and f6 are under attack. Hübner plays queen c7, and now again precision, not go for the greedy rook f6, because again e4 creates counterplay. And now, for example, taking the knight on d6 leads to a perpetual check, queen c3, king a3, queen a5, and there is a perpetual check, because king cannot go back to b1, because then white gets even mated. Whereas after e4, queen d2, knight b5, all of a sudden the bishop is without good squares to go to. Yeah, and bishop b4, queen e5 exposes the rook on f6. So again, another line which shows black's counterplay. So Tal was precise again, not going for the pawn, but going, bishop b4, getting the bishop away from the attacked square on c3 with tempo by attacking that knight on d6. Knight b5 now, getting away with the knight. Now e4 doesn't work, because the knight can be taken, queen takes d6, and black only has two checks, queen c2, king a3, queen c1, king a4, and that's pretty much about it. It's a pawn up, and b5, king a5 again will only lead to mate for black after queen a6. So the knight was hanging now, so knight b5, and now with everything under control picking up the second pawn after rook f6. So you see how Tal managed to control black's counterplay by paying attention to the possible lines, to possible tricks that black had in the position. So winning a second pawn. Now, for example, knight d4 is a move that white needs to consider because c2 is attacked, but here white has a very nice combinational solution. Rook takes a6 check. The point is to force the king to come to b8 either now or after b takes a6, queen takes a6. Now queen a7 is not possible because the rook is dropped, and if king b8, bishop d6 wins the queen and the game. So this would have been a nice combinational solution and finish. INHUMAN played a5 instead, but now bishop d6 attacks the queen and the knight is still attacked, forces simplifications, and after knight takes d6, rook takes d6, black's position falls apart as another pawn will likely be lost. In positions with queens and rooks only on the board, king's safety is of primary importance, and here we see that white's king is perfectly safe, much safer than black's king, who has been weakened by this pawn being on a5. And with a safe king, white can safely just go after the pawn on h6 or simply advance his pawns and win the game without problems. The last move, move 40 by INHUMAN, was e4, but simply queen d2, attacking the pawn on a5, attacking the pawn on h6, means that black will lose another pawn. He will be 3 pawns down, and here he just resigned. So very nice, convincing victory by Tal, and you see the game was divided in two phases. The first one after the opening, where Tal was very exact in the combinational phase of the game, and then the second phase, the conversion phase, where he was also exact but in a different way exact. The precision in this phase was preventing counterplay by the opponent. So we can conclude then this video. I think it's a good complementary material to the newsletter that discusses this precision and exactness of the players and connects it to the different types of position that we have on the board and how this is related to the precision that the player needs to exhibit. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to pretty much everything that I have. The YouTube channel, my Substack, my newsletter, the Substack. Follow me on Twitter, check my Chessable courses. And well, in the meantime, I'll check out my material and I'll see you next week with the next video. Take care in the meantime.